this is your host, Julia Napini. I am a clinical and forensic social worker who owns a counseling practice and a consulting business. In this show, we discuss the challenges of being successful in business while maintaining your integrity and staying true to yourself. Join me while I interview other professionals and share insights from life and experience. Let's talk about RingRx, our latest sponsor. RingRx is a high-quality, HIPAA-compliant telephone, text, and fax communications platform. They provide seamless, cost-effective communications for behavioral therapists, medical practices, hospitals, and other healthcare providers. RingRx is designed for modern healthcare environments. They offer customizable features like a phone app, automated patient outreach, voicemail, after-hours call routing, and top-quality desk phones. Try RingRx for free today at ringrx.com. And if you sign up using the code CLIMB, you'll get 15% off your monthly bill forever. Conditions apply. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Compassionate Climb podcast. My guest today and I are going to have a conversation that's a little bit more clinical in nature today. We talk a lot about business and entrepreneurial spirits on this show, and I thought that this would be a really helpful topic for all of you out there. So especially those of you that are social workers. So Laura Beaver, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
I'm excited to have you. I had a lot of fun on your show, and definitely in getting to know you better, I was intrigued, and I thought this would be a good opportunity to peel back the layers of the onion. So fill the audience in on why providing quality supervision is something that you are so passionate about, and fill us in on your career climb.
Yeah, so I am an LCSW, and I think I'll probably start with my career climb because that kind of really led me to what I'm doing now in many ways. So I was really lucky. I majored in social work mostly because my mom told me to. I was going to major in sociology, and she's like, you can't do anything with a sociology degree, major in social work. And I actually found out at that time that my mom had been a social worker, and I never knew that. My whole life, she'd been a teacher. So that was kind of cool. But I majored in social work in my undergrad program, and I immediately went into an MSW program. So I was really lucky in the sense, like, I feel like I found what I was supposed to be doing, or the field I was supposed to be in really early on in my career. And I knew it's what I wanted to do, from the minute I took that first intro class. So after I got my graduate degree, I was in the field for a little bit, working with veterans and vocational rehabilitation. And I, at the time, was teaching as an adjunct, which was basically an old field instructor of mine didn't want to teach this class anymore. And she asked me if I would do it. And that was how I got into that. I wasn't seeking it. And so a few years out of my graduate program, the university approached me to see if I would like to teach full time. I'd never considered it. And I think I had a really different entry into higher ed because most people that go into higher ed are doing it on purpose. Not that I wasn't seeking a full-time job in higher ed. I didn't have a PhD. I never really thought about tenure or anything like that. But I really enjoyed teaching because I loved helping students find their place in the field. That is one of the things I loved about that job. And I felt like when I was in the classroom, I could kind of help them have some understanding and discernment about different areas of the field and really build up their passion for it. Because I love the field. I think it's so vast. I think there's so many different opportunities. I've gotten to do so many different things, and I never had to go back to school. And I think that's one of the great things about social work. And so I ended up working full-time started as a professor, and this was in a BSW program. Then I became a field director. Then I became a program director. Then I switched universities and became a field director there. And then I got kind of a little burnt out of higher ed, honestly, and I started doing private practice on the side. And my family relocated unexpectedly. It was a good thing, but we just didn't see it coming. And when that happened, I had to leave my job in higher ed. And that's when I went into private practice full time. It was a good transition for me, but I knew I wasn't done with higher ed. I just knew that I didn't want to do it in the way that I had been before.
Mhm.
And as I reflected on that, one of the things that I think happened while I was there in that period of time was I saw the role that we had change so much. I felt like I didn't get to pour into students the way that I was able to before, because so many other demands are put on people that are in full-time higher ed now. And what's so interesting is I actually really believe that like practicum experience, no matter what like sort of field of mental health you're in, but that practicum experience is the entry point of where someone will either become passionate about what they're doing and want to continue to learn and grow and develop, or where they will start to get burnt out. And I think we've actually done a disservice to people in the field by the expectations we're putting on them, and we're burning people out before they even get in. And I think supervision is a huge, huge cornerstone and turning point that can make a big difference in that. I'm not going to be able to change, in social work, it's CSWE. CSWE is a whole thing, and my goal is not to change what they're doing or change the EPAWS, or I think the curriculum is great. I think maybe the model and how, it seems like it just became this box that we check. And like supervision even became a box that we check. Oh, did you have your hour with your supervisor? And even during licensure, like, oh, are you doing your hour? And most of the times it's just structured as this thing of like, okay, well, tell me what's going on, what feels helpful, which isn't bad, but I think we are missing a huge opportunity to really, really, really pour into the next generation of people in the field. That is what's going to carry the mental health field forward. And because I don't want to just specifically talk about social work, even though that's like my big thing. I feel really strongly that this is super important in social work, because many, many people are getting their MSW and leaving before they even actually go into practicing social work.
Mhm.
They have a practicum experience and they think, oh my gosh, this is not what I should be doing, or this was a bad experience. I'm going to do something else with this degree. And supervisors play a huge role in that. I'm not saying it's all on them, but I think quality supervision that is paying attention to the learning process and paying attention to the supervisor's experience as well, whether that's with clinical hours or with students, is a huge piece in like building up the sort of morale of somebody, including the supervisor. And really, I believe will exponentially pay dividends into every client that those people touch. So while I'm not necessarily in a role right now where I am directly doing that in the higher ed world, I really love helping supervisors be passionate about what they're doing and making sure that they're getting poured into too, because one of the things I found too is it's like people get the designation and then it's just, again, it becomes a routine. I think so much of our jobs feel routine sometimes. And when we are in routine, things get a little stagnant, and that's not good for anybody. So, yeah.
Awesome. I really appreciate you going into that. So we definitely share a lot of our views on this subject, and it is helpful to provide context for people so that they have background. So what are the ways that you are focusing on this in your career now? So fill people in on what this looks like and how so it's not in the higher ed realm, but some ways that you're incorporating this into your work.
So I have created something called the Supervisor Support Network. And it's really just, I try to provide resources to supervisors. I try to begin a discussion of, what are you seeing? What's going on? What challenges are you having? Or like, hey, here's a great thing to talk about in your supervision this week, throwing out ideas for that. And really helping supervisors feel supported and seen in their roles, and resourcing them so that it feels like something that they also have support in. Because it's so interesting that up until the point where you don't need supervision anymore, once you're there, like, unless you're pursuing consultation of some kind, you really are kind of like this boat out in the sea. And I think it's very similar for supervisors too. We don't always realize that they need continued camaraderie and consultation and support. And so I really want to be able to provide that for them just to make that role feel easier. And so we have a Facebook group, and I have a newsletter that goes out. We're going to be doing a therapist book club next year, which I'm really excited about. And I just try to pop in there and, get the pulse of things and then just be a support and also help connect people too. Because I think, again, we get so siloed so easily. So yeah, that's that. And then I do speak quite a bit at like different conferences. I was just did a presentation a few weeks ago for the NASW in Minnesota. I did one a few weeks ago at the conference here in Texas, which was really interesting. It was all about like the BSW and MSW and what we're seeing in field education and really what it looks like to pour into what we call field instructors, which is a supervisor for a student, with the explosion of online programs and how that changes the landscape. Because just because there's more programs and more students, which is great, doesn't mean there's more availability of supervisors. So that's another thing is I think I want people to want to have this role and to be excited about it. And I hope to be able to grow that group. So if we're going to have this many more people out in the field of social work, we need to have people supporting them too. That are passionate and want to be doing that. So.
Yes, for sure. So I'm thinking from the bottom up. So if we start from the supervisee perspective, what is some of the feedback that you've received, things that you gathered from your own experience when you were in that position that makes supervision from the perspective of the supervisee the most effective and impactful?
Yeah, I think so often, and I'm so guilty of this, we forget what it was like to not know anything, to be like a little, I say like a little baby social worker. I had no idea what I was doing, and I probably didn't know, I was looking to my supervisor of what are appropriate like work boundaries. Like, do I stay late to finish notes, or do we do that tomorrow? Do I, you're looking to that person to model things in many ways. And so I think sometimes as a student, I'm remembering too, like, the story I tell all the time is I went into we did 3 different practicum placements in my BSW program. And the last one was a year long. And we were assigned placements. Right now, a lot of the model is it's like a job search and students are like, go find it and then tell me where you're going. I don't believe that model is working anymore. And we can talk about it if you want to, but, I got assigned and I went, and it was like a very well-known agency, a well-respected social worker, and she quit the first day I was there. And so I was like, what do I do now? And so I just think that like students want to learn, they want to absorb, they are so excited, and they bring a different energy. And I think that we are really missing out if we don't absorb some of that ourselves as supervisors, but also just grow that for them. And it's also interesting because we forget that they are learning skills. So they've learned all the knowledge. Now they're trying to like learn how to do the thing. They're not learning a job. That's for when you're out of school. They're learning skills. And so really just from a supervision perspective, what are the skills they're working on and how are you providing opportunities for that? I think is a big piece of like working with that group of people.
Yeah, absolutely. So when you have someone that is maybe newer in their career versus maybe a little bit more seasoned, how do you think that approach should be adjusted? So I'm thinking for somebody newer, a lot of the time we as the supervisor feel compelled to jump in. And especially if we're managing that dual role of maybe practice owner and supervisor. Mm-hmm. And so I think what I have shifted in my own practice is really encouraging them to kind of let me know where their head is at and what they're thinking before I jump in versus maybe somebody who's a little bit more seasoned, making sure that before you hire them, they're really open to feedback. What is the best way feedback can be received? And that you're kind of collaborating on that discussion. But what are some other differences that you've experienced or do you think are helpful distinctions with someone dependent upon where they are in their career?
Yeah, I think the number one question people have at the beginning of their career is like, am I doing this right? The stakes feel high, when you're doing, for us, like the clinical therapy world. I think the stakes feel high when you're in that room with somebody and like they're looking to you.
Right.
So I think so often people new in their career want to know that they're doing it right. But I think part of supervision is like leaning into the discomfort that we don't always know.
Sure.
And we're not going to always, like, we are going to mess up, but how do we repair with clients, right? And that was one thing I really appreciated about my clinical supervision and some of the consultation I've gotten since I've gotten my clinical license, was that there was never a thing of like, this is how to do it, and if you don't do it this way, you're doing it wrong. I really appreciated, it was always like, okay, well, what do you think you should do? Which at
Yes.
first I was like, well, I thought you were going to tell me what to do. But nobody's going to tell you what to do when you're in that room. You have to be able to like lean in and figure it out, right? But what I really appreciated about many of those experiences was understanding that it is an art. And at the beginning, you've learned the skills and the knowledge. Now you're learning your art to it. And that is a process. And I
Yes.
think sometimes we forget that. And so, it's just like a painting. Like, I don't paint, but I would imagine if I was doing a painting, right, I might do work on it one day and the next day try to come back and mix the same color blue, and I can't.
Mhm.
So then I got to like adapt and change. And okay, well, what am I going to do with that there? And, you just look at it for a while and you figure out what is making sense for you to make that, come together well. And I think
Mhm.
we forget it's a practice and an art, and
Mhm.
entry into the career. That was one, those words were never used, but I really felt like that's what my supervisor really did, was she gave me space to be able to understand my own art and approach, because copying her wasn't going to feel authentic. And then what was I going to do when she wasn't my supervisor anymore? I had to be able to do it on my own eventually.
Mhm.
And so I really appreciated that. And I think people that, when you're in employment and supervision, it's a tricky thing to balance. And so sometimes I think really naming the time and the space, like if you have to have like work related things, that can be helpful, but then it can also be like, and in this time, like, I'm just your supervisor. So like, if
Right.
you're feeling overwhelmed, if you've seen too many clients this week, like, you can say those things, and this is a space for that.
Mhm.
I remember there was a time I got really overwhelmed with just like, all of a sudden I had a lot of clients and I had a lot of stuff going on at home. And I was like, but you're not supposed to be my therapist. I don't know if I can talk to you about this. And she's like, this is impacting your work. We have to talk about it. And I
Mhm.
think bringing some, like, not being afraid to bring that in there. And that means you have to also be able to have rapport and relationship with each other. It's not
Absolutely.
just this like transactional time that you have. So yeah.
Those are some great points. I mean, I'm thinking back and I love the way you verbalize that someone's coming into supervision and they typically will have the education, the degree, maybe they're working towards that licensure, they're gaining that experience, they're actively working with clients, but that the supervisory process is so much about them learning their own style and how they're going to be as a therapist. And I think back to when I started in community mental health and I had the opportunity to observe other clinicians. Beyond that, there was no other opportunity to see how anybody else structured their sessions. And so, unless you're in a group setting, so we do peer supervision and consultation depending on licensure level, we kind of divide the team up. Or if you join a consultation group yourself, you seek it out, you're not always hearing what that's like. And even if you're getting somebody's perception of what it's like, you're not in the room. So I definitely see that as a component of supervision, but didn't necessarily think of it that way. So from the perspective of the supervisor, because it sounds like you do a lot to really ensure that they're getting their needs met and that it's a sustainable role for them. So what are some of the key things that you have learned from conversations that you've had with supervisors that lead them to want to continue to do this for the long haul, for it to feel really rewarding?
The thing I hear the most is how invigorating and exciting it is when they're working with somebody who's bringing in new ideas and good questions, which means that a supervisor is putting themselves in a role of continuing to learn and grow themselves.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're going into supervision from an obligation or, a voluntold position, that's hard.
Mm-hmm.
That's hard, right? Because you have to, and I always say, like, supervising a student especially is never work off your plate. If you're taking on a student thinking you're going to get work taken off your plate, you need to reconsider taking that student on. And it can be the same way, if you're hiring people for your practice that you're going to supervise.
Mm-hmm.
It is work to have new clinicians around because they need more support than a seasoned clinician will.
Right.
And so I think kind of knowing that it's not going to like take work off our plate necessarily. So wanting to continue to learn and develop ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
And then also to know that there is beneficial work in our own, like, cause I'm always self-reflect. I do IFS as part of my model, like interventions that I do. And so we love looking at ourselves in IFS. So to me, I learned a lot about myself when like questions that are brought up, even in like my consultation groups that I lead and things. And it's really interesting when a supervisee or someone brings up a question that I'm like, yeah, I'm struggling with that with a client right now. Like, this is okay. We're not going to ever arrive at some point where like nothing is ever hard. Right. And so knowing that for ourselves, because I think when we think we've got it figured out, that's not a good place for us to be. And so knowing that there's going to be some commonality too, and that's okay. There's nothing wrong with that.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to learn how that person's looking at it and examining it. And that might inform how maybe I want to look at it differently. And so I think that's a huge piece of it. You also have to be really willing to have hard conversations because the reality is we are the gatekeepers to the profession. And sometimes it's not appropriate for everybody, or people need some more work in specific areas before you can recommend that they, get their clinical license or they pass that class or whatever. Mm-hmm. And so you have to care a lot more about their growth and development in the profession as a whole than you do about maybe being comfortable in those situations. And that's hard. That's hard. That's something I do hear a lot is like those hard conversations that you have to have sometimes with supervisees. But it's worth it, especially when they stick around and they want to change and they want to grow as well. Like those are the big moments too. So yeah.
So what you're pointing out that kind of makes for a successful supervision from the supervisor's perspective, I feel is just such a great life lesson. And I feel like being in a leadership role and owning a group practice, I've really had to lean into kind of that awareness of myself and how I respond to things, that openness to feedback, willingness to learn, to continue to grow. So it's nice to hear how that translates in this type of a relationship as well. And I'm also thinking about how important it is in a field that has so much gray area. We have our ethics, we know the law, we've been in school, we know what we were taught, but there's so much of what we do where there isn't this black and white, clear cut, this is what you do. And it's invaluable to have that opportunity to take a step back when you're outside of the session and you're not in the moment, kind of reflect on what your initial instinct and gut reaction was. And then you have somebody where you can process out the specifics of that case and kind of different scenarios and what that would look like. And so I've just seen how that's played out in my own practice, and it's so vital. So I'm thinking about so those that are listening, that are in a position of being a supervisor, maybe they're working at an agency or they have their own practice and they're a supervisor. Maybe they supervise people from the outside that aren't necessarily even working with them. What are some really good questions that you have come across that you would recommend people try? Maybe for those that think like, I'm thinking that this process is going really well, but maybe there's more that I could delve into. Or for those that are thinking, I'm kind of going over the same things, just checking in around cases. We're not really expanding beyond that. What are some really good thought-provoking questions that can really enhance the experience for both?
I think one of the best questions that you can ask a supervisee is, and whether they're talking about a case consultate, like a case that's coming up, or something that happened in the workplace or something, what was going on inside of you in that moment?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if anybody ever had due process recordings. I
Oh,
might
yes.
be dating myself a little bit, but there is a column. It's like, okay, you have a log, social worker said, client said, blah, blah, blah. Then you have like the nonverbals from the client, maybe like a skill you're labeling, but then there's a whole column of, and this is what was going on inside of me. And if we're not paying attention to that, we are doing a disservice to ourselves and to our clients, because it's in the room with us. I think I came from an era of social work that was like, you stay at the door and only your social worker self walks into that room. But I actually think that's such a disservice to the client and to ourselves. That's how people get burnt out, right? And I think we've learned a lot, but so often we get caught up in the like, what should I do? What's the intervention? How do you handle this? And we don't spend enough time on, and what was going on inside of you? How were you feeling? What was, were you panicking? Were you having a hard time? Were you like, I don't understand why this client is here today? Whatever it was, because we all have those things.
Mm-hmm.
And if we're constantly just trying to like push them to the back and not pay attention to them,
Right.
it's going to continue to come up for us. And what better time to do it than when you're in supervision, when you have somebody else to be able to talk to about it. So I think that is a really great question to ask. It can feel uncomfortable at first, but I think supervisors can always lead by saying, okay, here's an example for me. And like, this is what happened when, this client did this. This is, oh my gosh, like I started having like, a thought or emotion come up. I think that is like a really great question to ask.
Yeah.
I personally prefer to have a more structured time than like an open-ended, okay, so what's going on? I always am remembering as a student, and I'm sure a professor said this at some point in time, and I told my students this all the time. This is an hour that you get with a professional in the field. You should be using that hour very well.
Mm-hmm.
What can you learn from them? What questions do you have about their experience? There is an onus on the supervisee. I think it shouldn't always be on the supervisor.
Mm-hmm.
And also as a supervisor, I have like a template that I would like to send supervisees that just is like, okay, where they can kind of fill it out to get themselves ready for that time, right? Help them reflect, but then also me to kind of know, okay, this is what they're coming in with, which we don't always get that advantage to therapy. I prefer that. I know it's not for everybody and it can be hard to do that.
Mm-hmm.
But I do think it's nice to have some structure. And so with students, it's like, what skills are you feel like, what are you missing from your experience? Because I think so often students don't know they can speak up and say, I really want to learn how to do this and I'm not getting to. So I think about like, what skills are they experiencing? What's something they feel like they're growing in? What's something, things like that.
Mm-hmm.
For clinical stuff, depending on the environment, right? Like I know sometimes those that go straight into private practice, it does feel like a panic of like, I got to fill my caseload so I can pay my bills.
Yeah.
And that is a whole thing. Or they feel like they're drinking from a fire hydrant sometimes at agencies when you just are like handed a caseload.
Right. So true.
And so just knowing that they need to get their feet under them a little bit before you can get into some deeper stuff sometimes. But one thing I really appreciated, and I know it's not this way in every state, my clinical supervisor spent time in every supervision on something specific from the DSM.
Okay.
Because we had to take our clinical license after our clinical test after our hours. So not every state does it that way.
Sure.
And I appreciated, I was a little bit more further. I got my LCSW later. I didn't get it straight out of grad school. So I appreciated hearing, and she had a lot of knowledge. She had worked in an emergency department, so she had seen a lot. And so I really appreciated her being able to present like, okay, this is what this looks like though.
Mhm.
Like, here's the criteria, but like, this is what it looks like in real life.
Yeah.
That was really helpful for me. I felt like I really learned a lot. That may not be for everybody. And so that's always something you could ask, like, what does the person want to get out of supervision? Like, do they need more like of that clinical knowledge? Are they wanting to learn more about like how to run a group, or because they didn't get that experience in school, whatever it is.
Yes.
I think it's always good to check in, because what I find is when one person has a set of expectations and somebody else has a different set of expectations, that's where things go awry and people get disappointed or conflict happens. So just knowing what somebody is hoping to get out of it too can be a really important piece of the puzzle as well.
Yeah, that's such a great question to ask, and to check in about it frequently, not just at the beginning. And I love the idea of a structure and you providing some examples for maybe somebody more early on, and then maybe more focus on the clinical stuff. So I have one final question, and then I would love for you to share how people can get in touch with you if they want to know more. So if every mental health supervisor were listening right now, what is something that you'd want them to know?
That what they're doing in supervision is just as important as the time they spend with the client.
Very true.
I think sometimes I'll speak for myself. I sometimes think of clients on like a different level than maybe a supervisee, but that time is just as important, because what you pour into that person, they're going to pour into clients, and think about the impact of that, like the exponential impact of what you pour into a supervisee, that they're going to then take that to however many clients they see. So maybe even, I don't want to say more important, maybe they're even, but that it matters deeply. It matters deeply. And just like, walking into a client session kind of frazzled and hurried and all of that is not a good place to be. It's the same with supervision. Like at that time, we have to hold ourselves accountable to walking into that time in a place that is ready to, give our supervisees our attention and space and all of that as well.
I couldn't agree with you more. What a great note to end on, to keep everybody thinking about when this episode is over. So let everyone know if they have more information. Maybe they would like that template that you suggested. They want to know a little bit more about what you do. What's the best way for them to get in touch?
The best way right now is just to join our Facebook group. So if you just go on Facebook and search Supervisor Support Network, we're in there. We have interviews with other supervisors like yourself that we post in there. And we also post those on YouTube. And that's a great place to get started. I have a website in progress. It's not done yet, because we're hoping to have a membership component at some point too. Nice. So right now, though, if you're not on Facebook, which I totally respect not being on social media at all, just shoot me an email, Laura Beaver, just like the animal, consulting@gmail.com.
Awesome. Thank you so much for being on the show and for the work that you do. Very much appreciated.
Thanks for having me.
If you like what you're hearing, please rate and review. This will help others find us and benefit as well. The Compassionate Climb podcast represents the opinions of Julia Napini and her guests. The information provided is intended for educational purposes only and should not be taken as legal advice. If that is what you are seeking, please consult an attorney.